February 1991. Inside the Soviet Ministry of Defense in Moscow, the atmosphere was already heavy with political anxiety. The economy collapsing, the republic slipping away, and a Cold War machine straining under its own weight. Yet, on this particular morning, none of that mattered. The highest-ranking generals in the Soviet armed forces were huddled inside a sealed, windowless briefing room, staring at a series of incoming reports from the Gulf War. What they were reading made no sense to them. It violated every assumption their doctrine was built upon. The Soviet Union had spent decades exporting its military philosophy to its allies. Iraq, equipped with T-72 tanks, ZSU-23-4 Shilka anti-aircraft systems, and shoulder-fired SA-16 missiles, represented the pinnacle of Soviet-designed warfare outside the Warsaw Pact. The Gulf battlefield was supposed to be a testing ground that proved the durability of their technology. Instead, it was becoming a live demonstration of its collapse. The first alarming transmission came from an Iraqi Republican Guard commander near the Kuwaiti border. He wasn't reporting stealth aircraft, precision-guided cruise missiles, or high-altitude bombers. He was reporting something far more primitive, something that shouldn't have mattered in modern air combat. A slow-moving American aircraft lingering low over armored columns. According to him, it was wiping out tanks with frightening ease. The Soviet analysts looked for mistranslations. None existed. By every standard of Soviet air defense theory, such an aircraft should have been annihilated within seconds. The Shilka alone, with its radar-guided cannons firing thousands of rounds per minute, was designed to shred low and slow targets long before they could fire a shot. Yet the Iraqi crew reported the opposite. They claimed they had struck the aircraft multiple times, watched sparks fly from the fuselage, and it still didn't fall. A second report followed from another sector, describing the same silhouette. A straight-winged, cross-shaped aircraft diving low, firing its cannon, and pulling up through clouds of tracer fire seemingly untouched. The Iraqis said that even Igla missiles struck it without bringing it down. To the Soviet generals, this resembled myth, not battlefield reporting. But what unsettled them most wasn't just the survivability of the aircraft. It was the behavior of the pilot. According to intercepted Iraqi radio chatter, the pilot wasn't avoiding danger. He seemed to fly directly into it, making repeated attack runs through walls of anti-aircraft fire. In Soviet doctrine, a pilot's life was preserved through speed, altitude, and distance. This American pilot appeared to embrace the opposite. As the generals leaned over the grainy reconnaissance photograph identifying the aircraft as the A-10 Thunderbolt II, a single question hung in the silent room. How could something this slow, outdated, and vulnerable survive, let alone dominate, a battlefield built on Soviet principles? The deeper Soviet analysts dug into the incoming data, the clearer it became that the issue was not an isolated battlefield anomaly. Report after report repeated the same improbable pattern. Iraqi armored units, armed with Soviet-designed equipment and supported by dense anti-air defenses, were being systematically dismantled by a single type of aircraft that, by all established doctrine, should not have survived long enough to make even one attack pass. The contradiction struck at the very heart of Soviet military theory. For decades, the Red Army had built its air defense strategy around layered firepower, designed to create no-fly zones over advancing armor. Tanks like the T-72 were engineered with the expectation that friendly air defenses would protect them from low-flying threats. If a NATO aircraft attempted to close in for a gun run, the Soviets believed the volume of fire would be overwhelming. And yet, the battlefield evidence showed the reverse. The low-flying American aircraft was the predator, not the prey. One particularly troubling intercept described a Republican Guard unit that had fired everything available, machine guns, cannons, and missiles, at the incoming aircraft. The gunners saw impacts. They saw debris. They assumed the kill was certain. But instead of falling, the aircraft pulled up, circled, and returned for another attack. Soviet review officers re-examined the transcript repeatedly, convinced something had been mistranslated. Nothing was. The Iraqis even provided radar logs showing the aircraft taking missile strikes, losing altitude, and then recovering in a manner they could not explain. In Soviet aircraft, a direct hit from a man-portable missile almost always meant catastrophic hydraulic failure and immediate ejection. The idea of a pilot maintaining control after such damage contradicted every engineering assumption taught in Soviet aviation schools. What unsettled Soviet leadership further was the psychological dimension emerging from prisoner interrogations. Iraqi tank crews described the aircraft with an unease bordering on fear. They did not fear the distant, high-altitude bombers. Those were abstract threats, sudden flashes followed by silence. The A-10 was different. It stayed. It hovered. It hunted. Many Iraqi soldiers reported that the aircraft would fly low enough for them to see the cannon rotating beneath the nose, the barrels glowing after sustained firing. Others spoke of the unmistakable growl of the Ju-8/a cannon, a sound they described as a buzzing roar that preceded the destruction of vehicles and bunkers with surgical precision. To Soviet ears, this was baffling. Precision low-altitude gunnery had been largely abandoned in favor of missile-based doctrines. Soviet planners considered strafing runs archaic remnants of World War II, a tactic guaranteed to get a pilot killed on a modern battlefield. Yet here was an aircraft performing those same tactics repeatedly and surviving. This discrepancy between expectation and reality forced the generals in Moscow to reconsider a possibility they had not entertained for decades. Had the Americans developed a platform intentionally built to endure the very firepower the Soviet Union relied on? The answer began to emerge when Soviet intelligence re-examined older American procurement files and design competitions from the 1970s. The aircraft now terrorizing Iraqi armored divisions was not a new secret weapon. It was a platform the Soviets had dismissed decades earlier as a misguided experiment in outdated warfare. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, known informally as the Warthog, had been conceived during the aftermath of the Vietnam War, at a time when the U.S. Air Force was forced to confront the limits of high-speed jet tactics in low-altitude close-air support. For the Soviet High Command, the revelation was jarring. They had assumed the Americans would follow the same trajectory as their own designers. Faster jets, more electronics, sleeker airframes. Everything about the A-10 contradicted this logic. Its straight wings, oversized control surfaces, and high-mounted turbofan engines resembled an aviation throwback. In an era defined by radar-guided missiles and Mach 2 interceptors, the A-10 looked almost primitive. Yet the battlefield reports showed it performing with an effectiveness far beyond anything in its weight class. The engineers in Moscow began to analyze photographs and wreckage reports in an attempt to understand why. What stood out immediately was the aircraft's construction philosophy. Instead of prioritizing speed or stealth, the Americans had built the A-10 around survivability. This was rarely practiced at such scale. The cockpit was embedded in a titanium armored shell, a literal bathtub of alloy plates engineered to withstand direct impacts from 23mm and 37mm anti-aircraft fire. No Soviet aircraft carried anything comparable. Equally unsettling was the aircraft's redundant control architecture. Multiple hydraulic systems were standard on most Western aircraft, but the A-10 included an additional failsafe: full manual reversion. Soviet aviation doctrine considered such a feature obsolete. Modern jets relied too heavily on hydraulics and electronic augmentation to fly without them. Yet here was an aircraft that could be flown home, manually after losing all hydraulic pressure, a possibility Soviet designers had eliminated decades earlier. This explained the radar contacts showing the aircraft regaining control after missile strikes. It explained the pilot radioing calmly about hydraulic failures instead of ejecting. It explained what the Iraqi gunners witnessed when damaged A-10s pulled up and climbed away, visibly hit but still airborne. But even these features didn't fully account for the devastation found on the desert floor. The most disturbing reports came from Soviet advisors performing battlefield assessments alongside Iraqi officers. They examined T-72 and BMP-2 hulls torn open in ways they had not seen before. The penetration holes were clean, round, and consistent, suggesting extreme kinetic energy rather than explosives. They were spaced in tight clusters, as though produced by an impossibly accurate, high-rate cannon firing from close range. The Soviets suddenly understood that they were not merely facing an unusually durable aircraft. They were facing a platform whose primary weapon was designed specifically to defeat the best armor the USSR exported. And this realization forced them into the next question. What kind of gun could tear through a T-72 as if it were made of sheet metal? The answer emerged only when Soviet analysts finally shifted their attention from the airframe to the aircraft's defining feature, the cannon protruding from its nose. Early battlefield rumors had described it as unusually large, but the scale was not understood until reconnaissance imagery and recovered shell fragments were compared with known American weapon systems. What the A-10 carried was not the typical 20mm aircraft gun found on fighters like the F-16. It was a weapon of an entirely different category. The Gu-8/A Avenger, a 7-barrel, hydraulically driven 30mm Gatling cannon capable of firing nearly 4,000 rounds per minute. To Soviet engineers accustomed to optimizing weight, aerodynamics, and speed, the weapon appeared absurdly oversized. Yet the battlefield evidence showed its effectiveness was undeniable. The depleted uranium rounds it fired were long, dense, and self-sharpening upon impact. When striking armor at high velocity, they behaved less like bullets and more like concentrated chisels of metal energy. This explained the sewing machine damage pattern noted in destroyed Iraqi vehicles. The A-10 did not rely on a single precise hit to disable armor. Instead, it unleashed streams of penetrators that sliced through composite plating, ignited fuel compartments, and ruptured ammunition stores with devastating predictability. Soviet advisors examining the wreckage realized that conventional armor philosophy, built around resisting explosive warheads, was poorly matched against a weapon designed to defeat armor through pure kinetic penetration. The most sobering realization, however, came from understanding how the gun was integrated into the aircraft. The Americans had not added the Gu-8 as a secondary feature. They had built the entire aircraft around it. The barrel sat perfectly aligned with the aircraft's centerline, preventing recoil from imparting yaw during firing. The nose landing gear was offset to accommodate the drum. Nearly every structural element of the A-10 was arranged to support the gun's operation. For Soviet planners, this design philosophy was alien. Their aircraft were designed around engines, avionics, and speed. The Warthog was designed around a single purpose: killing tanks. Compounding the problem was the tactical flexibility this granted American pilots. To employ the Gu-8 effectively, they had to fly low, often below 300 meters, and commit to attack runs that exposed them to concentrated fire. Yet battlefield evidence showed they willingly did so, confident in the aircraft's ability to survive hits that would destroy conventional jets. The resulting combination of survivability, firepower, and pilot aggression created an attack profile for which Soviet doctrine had no countermeasure. But the problem for Moscow was not yet fully understood. The real shock came when the Soviet Air Force attempted to formulate a response, only to discover that their fastest and most modern aircraft were almost entirely ineffective at intercepting the slow-moving American attacker. This contradiction, speed failing against slowness, set the stage for the Soviets' most humbling realization. The Soviet Air Force's instinctive solution to the A-10 problem was straightforward. If ground-based defenses could not reliably stop the aircraft, then interceptors should finish the job. By every metric of traditional air power, the A-10 was a perfect target. It was slow, with a top speed barely exceeding 700 kilometers per hour. It operated at low altitude, where maneuverability was limited. It had no radar, no afterburner, and no meaningful capacity for air-to-air combat. A MiG-23 or MiG-25 should have intercepted it with ease. Yet when Iraqi pilots attempted this, the results were an unexpected humiliation. American A-10s operated so low, often around 50 to 100 feet above the desert surface, that they blended into ground clutter, a region where Soviet radar systems struggled. High-speed interceptors scanning for traditional aerial targets were effectively blind to aircraft hiding in the Earth's radar returns. Iraqi MiG-25 pilots described seeing nothing but static on their scopes, unable to differentiate the A-10 signature from the terrain itself. The speed disparity became a tactical disadvantage. Supersonic aircraft, optimized for high-altitude engagements, lacked the turning radius and visual acquisition capability needed to strike a low, slow-moving ground attacker. Pilots racing at Mach 2 simply overshot the engagement envelope before ever identifying a target. By the time they circled back, the A-10s had vanished into wadis or terrain folds that rendered radar tracking useless. For Soviet generals reviewing the reports, this was deeply unsettling. They had spent decades preparing for wars defined by speed, altitude, and missile exchanges. The A-10 operated outside that paradigm entirely. It did not rely on stealth technology or electronic warfare suites. Its invisibility came from terrain masking. Its survivability came from armor. Its lethality came from kinetic energy, not sophisticated guidance systems. And at the center of it all was the pilot. Intercepted communications painted a consistent picture. A-10 pilots were unflinching under fire, remaining in airspace saturated with cannons, SAMs, and machine guns long after any Soviet-trained pilot would have disengaged. To Soviet eyes, this behavior bordered on reckless. Yet it was precisely this willingness to stay low, stay slow, and stay engaged, combined with the aircraft's ability to absorb punishment, that made the A-10 uniquely dangerous. As more battlefield footage and destroyed armored columns reached Moscow, the scale of the disaster came into focus. The A-10 was not simply outperforming expectations, it was dismantling an entire doctrine. Tanks that had been designed to withstand NATO shells were being opened with alarming ease. Air defenses that should have formed an impenetrable shield were proving ineffective. High-speed interceptors designed for Cold War dogfights were powerless against an aircraft designed for a completely different type of war. By the time the Soviet General Staff completed its evaluation, one conclusion had become unavoidable. The A-10 was not an anomaly. It represented a fundamental mismatch between Soviet assumptions and the realities of modern close air support.